It was around 9 p.m. when I finally arrived at the cabin by Stillwater Lake. The place had been in my family for generations, nestled deep in the woods, where only gravel paths and faint memories led the way. Growing up, I'd heard countless tales from my grandfather about Stillwater. Stories of eerie sightings and strange sounds that drifted across the lake on quiet nights. I'd always dismissed them as nothing more than folklore. But this time, I was alone. The trip was meant to be a retreat from the city, a chance to clear my head and enjoy some peace and quiet. The last few months had been stressful, and the idea of a weekend away was appealing. I parked my car next to the cabin, noticing that the lake was as still as ever. The water, dark and glass-like, mirrored the full moon above, and not a single ripple disturbed its surface. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and made my way to the front door. It creaked as I opened it, sending a chill down my spine that I shrugged off as my imagination. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it. Simple, cozy, and filled with the faint scent of cedar. I set my bag down, flipped on a few lights, and opened a window to let in the cool night air. By 10 p.m., I was settled in, enjoying a cup of tea by the small fireplace. Outside, the lake was shrouded in darkness, with only the moonlight illuminating its surface. There was something calming about the silence out there, but the longer I stared into the dark, the more I felt an odd sense of unease. I chalked it up to the unfamiliarity of being alone out here. After all, I hadn't been to the cabin in years. As the clock neared midnight, a strange sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried by the wind, but it grew louder, echoing off the water. It sounded like humming. My first thought was that it must be an animal, perhaps an owl or a distant loon calling across the lake. But as I listened closer, the sound seemed almost melodic, like a tune someone might hum to themselves absent-mindedly. Curiosity got the best of me. I decided to step outside for a better listen. I grabbed a flashlight, its narrow beam cutting through the dark as I scanned the area around the cabin. The humming persisted, slow and eerie, drifting across the water. It was coming from the lake. I stood on the edge of the dock, peering into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the lake's perfectly still surface. The humming continued, unwavering, almost rhythmic. I couldn't place it. It was neither cheerful nor sorrowful, just an endless, haunting melody. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind, or perhaps some strange echo off the trees. But I knew, deep down, that this sound wasn't natural. After a few minutes, I went back inside, locking the door behind me and trying to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. I lay down in bed, listening to the creaks of the cabin settling, and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. The sound had stopped, but sleep didn't come easily. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a soft knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat as I sat up, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it. But then it came again. A faint, steady knock, like someone tapping their knuckles gently against the wood. I held my breath, listening. Who could possibly be out here at this hour? I knew there were no neighbors for miles, and no one knew I was here. The logical part of me insisted it must be a stray hiker or a camper who had lost their way. there was something strange about the timing. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. I lay in bed, heart pounding, staring at the door, waiting for something else to happen. But everything fell silent again, and eventually I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning I woke early, feeling groggy and on edge. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the cabin and making the events of the night feel like a distant memory. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. A strange sound and a random knock didn't necessarily mean anything. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. As I made breakfast, I glanced out the window toward the lake, half expecting to see something unusual. The water was calm, as always, and there was no sign of anyone or anything out of place. But when I walked outside to clear my head, I noticed something odd. There, in the dirt just outside the front door, were footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the morning light, but there was no mistaking them. They were small, as if made by a child or someone barefoot, and they led from the edge of the dock up to the cabin's door before disappearing entirely. A chill ran down my spine. I spent the rest of the day trying to keep busy, reading a book and taking short walks around the property. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept catching myself glancing over my shoulder, listening for sounds that weren't there. And every time I looked out at that lake, I half expected to see someone standing on the shore, watching me. As evening fell, I found myself growing increasingly uneasy. I considered packing up and leaving, but part of me felt foolish. It was just my imagination, I told myself. I wasn't going to let a few strange noises ruin my trip. But that night, the humming returned. I was lying in bed trying to sleep when I heard it again, drifting through the walls of the cabin like a ghostly lullaby. It was softer this time, almost like it was coming from inside the cabin itself. I sat up, clutching the blanket tightly as I listened, my heart racing. The sound grew louder, clearer, and this time there was no mistaking it. It was coming from the lake. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. There, on the shore, just barely visible in the moonlight, was a figure. They were standing ankle-deep in the water facing the cabin. Their features were obscured by the shadows, but I could make out the shape of their body, slender and motionless, as they hummed that haunting melody. I froze, watching as the figure slowly began to move, gliding further into the lake until only their head was visible above the water. And then, with one final, mournful note, they disappeared beneath the surface, leaving the lake as still as ever. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the empty shore, waiting for them to resurface. But they didn't. The humming had stopped and the night was silent once more. The next morning, I packed my things and left Stillwater Lake without looking back. I never told anyone about what I'd seen or heard that weekend, and I never returned to the cabin. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear that melody drifting through my mind, a haunting reminder of whatever awaits, patiently, beneath the still surface of Stillwater Lake.